How much responsibility do you feel that you have, particularly guys, the alt-right, who, as you say, some of them have enjoyed your work?
They haven't enjoyed my work.
I've definitely read bits on the internet.
Read more.
Okay.
Find some evidence.
Something is off with Jordan Peterson, and it's not what people think. This isn't about one bad interview or a viral clip taken out of context. It's about patterns and moments stacking up that even his strongest supporters are starting to question.
The hardest one is to tell the truth, or at least not to lie. And it's difficult to contend with the conflict that's inevitable if you try to do things in a straightforward manner.
Do you avoid telling the truth just to be kind?
Of course, you have to be.
From devastating health setbacks to a final crushing legal defeat against his own profession, the cracks are widening. Is this the end of an era for Jordan Peterson? It's hard to believe the man currently fighting for his legacy once stood at the top of the world, commanding a following unlike anything we've seen in our lifetime. Let's rewind to where it all began. The regulatory war, losing the professional license. As Jordan Peterson was busy building a global media empire, his professional colleagues back in Canada were quietly building a case. They weren't looking at his work on a clinical basis or his university lectures. Instead, they were focused on his public comments about things like political shenanigans, climate change, and gender identity. Every single tweet and social media post Jordan Peterson ever wrote was being saved, organized, and turned into a weapon against him. Unfortunately, in 2023, the College of Psychologists of Ontario decided these posts were disgraceful and unprofessional, which made them hand Peterson an ultimatum that felt more like a punishment than a request. He was ordered to undergo a social media coaching program to fix his public behavior. However, Peterson didn't see this as professional development. He saw it as a forced attempt to change his beliefs, and he chose to fight back with everything he had. This disagreement exploded into a legal war that lasted for more than 9 months. Peterson took his case through every level of the Canadian court system, arguing that his right to free speech was under attack. He believed that if a professional board could control his words online, they could control anyone. The battle reached its final stop at the Supreme Court of Canada in late 2024. And this was his last chance to protect his career and his title. When the court officially refused to hear his appeal, the door slammed shut. The decision was very clear. Either Peterson took the coaching or risked losing the license he had spent his entire life earning. But sadly, he went with the other option, obviously refusing to take the coaching. When we think about it, losing the title of clinical psychologist was more than a legal setback. It was a massive hit to his identity. For years, his authority came from the fact that he was a doctor who understood the human mind. Without those credentials, he was just another famous person with a microphone. But he didn't back down, though. He responded to this defeat by leaning into the role of a warrior. He told his followers that if the system could come for a man as famous as him, they could come for anyone. Peterson used the legal loss to prove his point that society was moving toward a dangerous level of control, and the move worked, making his following grow even larger. This case triggered a massive debate across the globe about where a professional's public life should end. People wondered if doctors and lawyers should be allowed to say whatever they want on the internet. Despite this whole court case, the business side of Peterson's life was already preparing for a massive shift. The content machine was quietly pivoting toward a new strategy that would change his legacy forever. The rise of a mere professor. Back in 2016, Jordan Peterson was a name very few people outside of a University of Toronto classroom actually knew. He spent his days as a soft-spoken psychology professor, grading papers and helping patients as a therapist also. But everything changed the moment he hit the upload button on a series of videos protesting a new Canadian law called Bill C-16. In the videos, Peterson argued that the government was trying to force people to use specific words, and he refused to comply. Immediately, the internet caught fire, and almost overnight, this man stopped being a teacher and became a global symbol for freedom of speech. People who felt ignored by the mainstream media suddenly had a champion who wasn't afraid to speak his mind. By 2018, this momentum turned into a full-blown movement, especially after the release of his book, 12 Rules for Life, and it was the talk of town for a long time. With this fame, Jordan Peterson stepped into the role of a father figure for millions of young men who felt lost in the modern world. His message was centered on the hero's journey, which was an old ideology that life is hard and one had to find meaning by facing your fears. Peterson encouraged his followers to stand up straight and take ownership of their mistakes. For a couple of years, he was like a secular preacher, filling up theaters in massive cities across the globe. As time went by, the transition from a University of Toronto professor to a global cultural phenomenon placed immense pressure on Jordan Peterson. Rather than returning to his quiet clinical practice, he embarked on a grueling schedule, visiting over 160 cities across the globe in less than 2 years, following the success of 12 Rules for Life. Even as his nerves frayed, his bank account exploded. Between book sales and a massive following on Patreon, he was earning millions. Peterson had built a financial empire that made him independent of any boss or university. He became too big to be canceled because he was the man with all the answers, telling the world how to stay strong in the middle of a storm. However, while everyone looked to him for directions, Peterson was quietly wandering into a dark forest of his own. Behind the scenes, the man who preached self-control was losing a battle against a secret dependency that was about to bring his entire world crashing down. A mastery loss. In 2019, Jordan Peterson, who spent years telling the world how to handle their problems, suddenly faced a crisis that he could not think of a way out of. He vanished from the public eye, and the reason was shocking. He had become physically dependent on benzodiazepines, a type of medication often prescribed for anxiety. And when he tried to stop taking them, his body went into withdrawal that even the best doctors struggled to manage. Immediately, his daughter, Michaela, stepped in to make a high-stakes decision that most medical professionals in North America found reckless. She flew him to Russia, where he was placed into a medically induced coma for 8 days to bypass the worst of the physical pain. This period was a massive turning point for his reputation, as critics were quick to point out the irony of the situation. Who would have thought that a whole master of self-discipline and the man who built a career on the idea of personal responsibility could fall victim to a substance dependency? But while he was unconscious and fighting for his life, his daughter, Michaela, became the face of the Peterson brand. She managed his updates and searched for alternative treatments, eventually moving him to a clinic in Serbia for a long and difficult recovery. This move outside of traditional Western medicine was a bold statement that matched the family's growing distrust of mainstream institutions. When Peterson finally made his big comeback in 2021, the world noticed a change immediately. He was no longer the calm, academic professor who carefully weighed every word. The man who returned was much more aggressive and seemed to be in a constant state of frustration. His social media presence became a lightning rod for controversy as he began posting unfiltered messages. Some experts wondered if the neurological trauma from the coma had altered his personality or his ability to regulate his emotions. He frequently and openly engaged in fights with what he describes as anonymous troll demons on social media, particularly ex-users, and the intellectual depth of his earlier work seemed to be replaced by a fiery political edge. With this, the public skepticism grew as people debated whether his personal chaos made his teachings less valid. His critics argued that if he couldn't keep his own house in perfect order, he had no business telling others how to live. Still, his fan base remained loyal, viewing his survival as evidence of his strength. Peterson had made it through a medical nightmare that would have ended most careers, but his return home to Canada was not the victory lap he expected. He arrived to find that his professional peers had been keeping a close eye on his behavior, preparing a legal challenge that would force him to choose between his voice or his career. The Daily Wire Plus pivot. In 2022, a massive financial and creative shift took place when Jordan Peterson signed a multi-million-dollar deal with the Daily Wire Plus. This was much more than a standard contract for a few podcasts. It was a complete transformation of how he presented himself to the world. He moved away from his roots as a quiet academic and stepped into the role of a high-production media star. This new era came with a very specific and unusual look that caught everyone off guard. He began wearing custom suits designed with wild colors and hidden symbols that looked more like a theatrical costume than a professor's wardrobe. At the same time, he was spending less time talking about clinical psychology and more time producing massive, expensive documentaries like Exodus and Logos and Literacy. The advice that originally made him famous for helping people fix their lives started to take a back seat to a much larger mission. Jordan Peterson was no longer a therapist working in a small office. He was becoming a full-time soldier in the global culture war. This change in direction wasn't easy for all of his fans to accept. He began taking very aggressive stands against environmental policies like net zero. This move confused and pushed away many followers who originally valued his scientific background. He also started focusing heavily on the World Economic Forum and theories about globalist control. For some people, it felt like he was losing his focus as a scientist and becoming a professional political fighter who was constantly on the attack. In May 2025, a visibly weary but intellectually sharp Peterson made a high-profile appearance on the Jubilee YouTube series, Surrounded. The format was designed for maximum friction because Peterson sat in the center of a circle, debating 20 atheists at once. While the video became a viral sensation, originally titled One Christian versus 20 Atheists, it also served as a Rorschach test for his modern persona. Supporters saw a brilliant defense of religious values from a man still recovering from health issues. However, critics pointed to his irritable tone and what they described as semantic games, arguing that the calm, exploratory professor of the past had been fully replaced by a combative debater. During a Jubilee debate, when a young man challenged Peterson for refusing to identify as a Christian. In response to that, Jordan Peterson adopted an adversarial tone, telling a participant, "You're really quite something, aren't you?" This version of Peterson was a world away from the professor who first became famous for defending free speech. He had built a massive and profitable fortress for his ideas, but the walls were starting to feel very thick to outsiders. It created a massive divide among those who had followed him for years. While some saw a someone who was finally speaking the whole truth without fear, others saw a man who had finally lost the plot. The divided legacy. Because of the sudden switch of Jordan Peterson, the massive audience that once followed him in lockstep is now splitting into two very different worlds. Longtime followers frequently talk about the old Peterson, the man who offered deep psychological insights and helped them put their lives back together. They feel a sense of loss when they look at the new Peterson, the person who seems more focused on winning arguments on social media than teaching in a classroom. This divide has led to heavy accusations from his critics. They claim his shift to the right was not a change of heart, though a calculated move to keep the money flowing. They point to his massive deals and expensive lifestyle as proof that he has become a professional provocateur rather than a serious thinker. Also, Jordan Peterson's connection to the manosphere has also made things complicated. You see, many young men discover Peterson with the same algorithms that promote figures like Andrew Tate. Although he explicitly advocates for traditional responsibility and monogamy, Peterson is often grouped with more radical voices by the media, which has solidified his reputation as a right-wing figure in a way that is hard to shake. This tension is visible in his latest intellectual work, We Who Wrestle with God, which arrived in early 2025. Supporters see it as a masterpiece that explores the deep roots of human belief. On the other hand, academic scholars are debating if it carries the same weight and rigor as his earlier, more grounded papers. Behind the scenes, the family business is run with a tight grip. Michaela Peterson has become a polarizing figure, acting as the main gatekeeper for her father's brand. Many people wonder how much of his current direction is his own choice and how much is being managed by his inner circle. She is often the one who decides which interviews he does and which topics he focuses on. Even with all this controversy, his influence on education continues to expand. He has put his name behind unaccredited schools such as Ralston College, trying to build a new way of learning that bypasses traditional universities. It is easy to get lost in the scandals, though we cannot ignore the thousands of people who still swear by his original 12 Rules philosophy. For many, he is the reason they stopped drinking, finished school, or repaired a broken marriage. But in spite of these controversies with the public opinion, Peterson was losing a much more private fight. The stress of the legal war was finally catching up to him. As he prepared for a new tour in 2025, his health took a sudden and terrifying turn. What exactly occurred again? A new health crisis surfaces. By late 2025, the constant stress of courtroom battles and global touring finally broke through Jordan Peterson's defenses. Reports began to surface that he was hospitalized once again, this time dealing with a condition known as chronic inflammatory response syndrome. His family explained that his body was essentially overreacting to environmental toxins, specifically mold. This wasn't a standard illness that a few days of rest could fix. It was a deep systemic collapse that forced him into a total silence. For 5 whole months, the man who usually had an opinion on everything completely vanished from the public eye. His social media feeds went quiet, and the empty space left his followers wondering if they would ever see him on a stage again. During this long disappearance, the only window into his life was through his daughter, Michaela. She posted several emotional updates that were a far cry from her usual confident tone. In these videos, she appeared visibly shaken, hinting that her father's condition was much more severe than the public realized. For nearly a month, Peterson was in the ICU battling pneumonia and sepsis, conditions his daughter described as near death. By December 2025, he had returned home, but remained out of public life for months as he dealt with systemic weakness and neurological symptoms. The situation became even more undeniable when his 2026 World Tour started falling apart. Major venues in cities like Leeds, Frankfurt, and Berlin were abruptly canceled. The official reason was a slow recovery, but the suddenness of the cancellations sent shockwaves through his fan base. It was sort of proof of how fragile his entire movement actually was, since everything depended on the health of this one man. The medical community began to debate the family's claims about a venomous environment being the sole cause of his collapse. While his inner circle blamed external toxins, others wondered if the years of physical and mental exhaustion had finally reached a point of no return. On platforms like Reddit and X, fan theories ranged from genuine concern to dark speculation about his future. There was a very real fear in early 2026 that Peterson might not survive this latest setback. His supporters watched as his empire sat in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a leader who was currently fighting for his life in a hospital bed. This period of silence highlighted a massive vulnerability in the Peterson brand. Without his voice, the momentum of his cultural movement began to stall. He had spent years building a parallel world of education and media, yet it all seemed to hinge on his personal vitality. People started to ask what would happen to his ideas if the man himself could no longer deliver them. Is Jordan Peterson the hero of his own story or the tragic victim of his own fame? The final verdict. As of April 2026, Jordan Peterson is recovering at home in Arizona. While his condition has improved significantly since late 2025, his recovery is described by his family and management as a marathon that remains slow and fraught with uncertainty. Even though he is no longer in a hospital bed, the energy he once had for city tours feels like a memory from a different lifetime. This brings us to the strange paradox of his legacy. Peterson is a man who built an empire by teaching people how to find stability in a chaotic world. For nearly a decade, his own life has been anything but stable. He has survived a life-threatening dependency, a medically induced coma, and a legal war that cost him his professional license. It is hard to ignore the irony of a man preaching about keeping a house in order while his own foundation has faced one earthquake after another. Some see this as proof that his ideas do not work, while others see it as proof of his resilience. As 2026 goes on, the big question is whether he will ever make a true comeback. While there are side talks of new events, many believe he is destined for a permanent role behind the scenes. He might spend his remaining years as an elder statesman, writing books and filming documentaries from a studio rather than facing the chaos of a live audience. Who knows? We never can tell. Still, Jordan Peterson remains a figure of intense devotion and equally intense scrutiny. Do you think Peterson is still going to win, or is the era truly over? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. For more content like this, tap on the next video on your screen.